All right. Hey, team. Today we're going to be talking about Next.js and how it can help solve the challenges of e-commerce. I'm Colby Fayok, and if you want to learn more about how you can build an online store with Next.js, headless WordPress, Snipcart, be sure to check out my new course on Level Up Tutorials called Ecommerce on the Jamstack. Today with me, we have a special guest. We have Salma AKA White Panther, who's a prolific streamer on Twitch and works with the DevRel community over at Contentful. Let's bring her in. Hey, how's it going?
Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a good day. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Do you want to give yourself a real quick intro?
Oh, yeah. So I have a really varied background. Fun facts. I used to be a musician, a music teacher, a comedian, front-end developer. And then this year in January, I started working for Contentful as a developer advocate. In that time, I've become a Twitch partner and a Microsoft MVP.
Amazing. That's quite the wrap. Yeah, your name has just all of a sudden become everywhere. I saw you on the Netlify stream, and it's awesome to see. And Next.js is so awesome, so it's really cool topic to be able to talk about.
Yeah, I kind of fell into the whole Next.js thing. The more projects I needed to make, the more I was reaching for Next.js because it's just such a joy to work with.
It is. Well, I appreciate you coming on, and everybody, as we are chatting, make sure if you have any questions, please do post them in the chat. If it's relevant to what we're talking about, I'll try to ask it while we're kind of in the middle of things. Otherwise, at the end, we'll do a dedicated Q&A. So if you're ready, let's jump into it. I guess we can start it off by, what is Next.js?
Next.js is a front-end framework that acts as a wrapper around the JavaScript framework React to build and bundle JavaScript into HTML pages that are delivered statically to the browser. And you can use TypeScript if you want. I think one of the biggest selling points of Next.js is that you can get up and running so quickly with zero configuration. And so what's really great about it is it's so quick to prototype and get those MVPs out and architecture ideas without all of the nonsense getting in the way, like Webpack configuration and blah, blah, blah. You can literally create a new Next app and deploy it to Vercel or Netlify in like 2 minutes. And
that's amazing.
It's also open source, so there's a chance as a developer using it, you can help shape the future of the framework if you want to get involved.
That's amazing. I remember when all the bigger frameworks started coming out and stuff. I remember just how mind-boggling, because I had just gotten done with a project with a client where I had to write my Webpack config from scratch. And the fact that I no longer, it was beneficial that I had to learn it, I feel, but the fact that I no longer have to touch that again is just, amazing.
But, yeah, super quick. And it's just, you don't have to worry about all those fancy things. I was saying the other day to somebody, do you remember back in the day when you were a front-end developer and you were messing with Apache configs and Nginx and all that stuff? And that is just gone. Yeah. And you can just build stuff, learn things and love what you do. And it just, that wasn't intentional. But, it's just, nothing gets in the way and you can just fly.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I always use an anecdote that one of the old PMs, they were a project manager, not a software engineer, and they were able to get a Gatsby site up on Netlify with zero experience. And I think that says a lot.
Yeah, it's really frameworks like Next.js and static site generators, and they've really opened up tech and the web for people who don't know all the fancy schmancy stuff about server configuration.
For sure. It's amazing. So speaking of static site generator, I heard you say, so is Next.js a static site generator?
Yes and no. So I want to first talk about how data powers our web applications and especially large scale web applications. Nothing is hard coded in the HTML anymore. You either get your content from a headless CMS or markdown files. You don't commit text and images and other content to your code anymore. And so traditional dynamic sites will use JavaScript on the client in the web browser to fetch and load that data from your content source at the time of request. But depending on the speed of the internet connection and the response times on the API, visitors to your site will most likely see the content appear a few seconds after loading the page. And what's wrong with that is that people need your content fast. They get bored. They are used to just bam, 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 and they'll bounce right off your site and you'll lose sales, especially if you're dealing with e-commerce. So that's a traditional site. So how is a static site different? That serves pre-built HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files as HTML documents merged and bundled with your data, which happens at what we call build time, when everything is built together on your CDN provider of choice, and then it serves those static files to a web browser. Now, popular hosting providers such as Netlify and Vercel allow you to connect your Nextjs GitHub repositories so that each time you push a change to your main branch, the application will be rebuilt and packaged up on a build directory on the server. And that's what's served by the CDN. So the data that you bundle on your HTML pages at build time is instantly served to your visitors on a static site compared to a dynamic site. So Next has this functionality. And also this means that your website can load without JavaScript enabled in the browser because it's just static HTML. So Next does that. However, it's also so much more. There are so many possibilities with data fetching in Next.js, and it's not just static. So you can do it in the static way on build time. You can do it at request time on the server to get HTML static pages. You can even do it in the traditional way on the client using React hooks. You can also do it via serverless functions in the background that's baked into the framework. And I know we're going to talk about this later. You can even do it by magic via incremental static regeneration, which is a magical way to rebuild your site statically without having to kick off a build process and use webhooks and push to GitHub and things like that. Nice. So it's a static site generator first, but it offers you so much flexibility depending on how up to date you need your data to be. And that's why it's really good for e-commerce, which we'll get to later.
That's beautiful. And on top of that, then, so I think you're kind of alluding to it. Does that mean that you can also server-side render with Next.js?
Yes, and this is where the HTML page is built and generated as a full HTML static document on the server at request time. So this is really useful. Say, for example, if you have query parameters on your URL. Now, in a traditional dynamic site, a visitor goes to your site with the query parameters on the URL, and it has to wait for the JavaScript to load to parse those query parameters and sort out the logic on the page for what you need to see. The server-side rendering can take those query parameters, build all the page from all the logic in your code, and then serve you a static page of HTML with everything baked in. So it's kind of like traditional web stuff, but like next level, and makes it super, super fast without having to wait for things to load. And you don't need skeleton loaders and all that. Please wait, I'm loading now. You don't need that.
And I think that's a great example. I never thought about the query parameters as a way to explain that, because it really is. I feel like there could be a disconnect there because, you do have to wait for the client to load in order to be able to take advantage of those query parameters. But cool, that's awesome. So what do you think makes Next.js generally a strong framework for large scale applications?
Okay, so I've got a bullet point, bam, bam, bam list.
Perfect.
Zero config, as we talked about before. Just go and build. Don't worry about all that. File system routing. Now, for any of you who've ever used a React app, I said this was going to be BAM, but it's not BAM, is it? For anyone who's ever used created a React app, routing's a little bit tricky because you have to say, right, I want this to go here when you go to this URL, and here's the component, and I want this there. Next.js has a pages directory, and any JS file or folder structure that you put in the pages directory, it automatically creates you a static route that you just, it's just like when you create a file tree in your on your computer. You can just go, I want that folder there, and it's magic. And talking of routes, Next.js also gives you dynamic routes pre-rendered at build time. So say if you have 1,000 blog posts in your headless CMS, and you want 1,000 blog posts to be built at build time, so you have static pages, Next.js allows you to just fetch all those routes and then build some logic to say, right, at build time, please make me 1,000 HTML pages. And which means that you're not, it's just, those can take a long time to build if you end up having thousands and thousands and thousands, but we've got a problem. We can solve that later. But, you just create a tiny block of code that builds you 1,000 pages, the hybrid data fetching. So static site generation versus server-side rendering versus client-side rendering. You get to choose how best to serve data to your visitors, rather than one size fits all, rather than having to get over the hurdles of, oh yeah, I made a little change and now I need to rebuild 1,000 pages and it's going to take 10 minutes in the pipeline. You have that flexibility. And the serverless function architecture is built in. It comes in an API folder in the pages directory, and it shows you an example. I think the developer experience in this case is really something special, because they document it, how to get started with it. So I've always said I was really, really afraid of serverless functions and lambdas and all that terminology before I discovered Next.js, because I'm a front-end dev, right? But this has opened my world into understanding how these things work and why you would use them. And the final pièce de résistance of Next.js is incremental static regeneration. Now, what is incremental static regeneration? Say you have a static site, right? And you have thousands and thousands of pages, which means that if you want to rebuild your site, say, for example, from Contentful, when you press publish, you've set up a webhook, which will send a build command to your hosting provider. But what if you don't want to rebuild your site over and over again because you've got 100 editors working on your e-commerce site, and this means the whole thing is going to be building all day long? Incremental static regeneration is a way to rebuild your pages statically in the background without webhooks and without having to kick off a build. For example, say the way you do this is with a revalidate parameter when you return the props back to the components on your page level. And what this does, say if you set the revalidate parameter to 1 second, visitor A will go to your site and get some data served. And in the background, Next.js is checking whether the data presented on the page is the same as a new data request from the API call. And if it's different, it will go and magically set the minions to work in the background, rebuild that page without any webhooks needing to kick off a build process. And then when visitor B comes to your website, they will see the new data. Now, the one caveat to that is if you really need this data to be up to date to the minute, then incremental static regeneration is not for you, because there is a chance that at least one person will see out of date data. However, I think it's a really nice middle ground between serving static data, but also having your data as up to date as possible. And fun fact, it was inspired by stale while revalidate, which is an older concept on server stuff, where you maintain stale data and you revalidate it in the background, and then you send new data to the client when it's available.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that's more of that's like talking about HTTP caching and stuff, right? Like that's a header, right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm like very mildly familiar, but that's kind of beyond it.
Again, I am too, but I wouldn't have known about any of this without Next.js, So I feel privileged to have been opened up to this world that is making my websites better.
Yeah. And I feel like you're absolutely right in that they're really doing a great job with documentation, but I feel like they're also building it generally in a way that feels more intuitive to me. Like you were talking about the Pages API, like it just feels natural creating a file with the name, and then that's going to be my page. So I love
it's kind of like really familiar, isn't it? Like you create a document in Google Docs or something, and then you know where it is. And the same with the Pages folder. It's
exactly, whoever
thought of that was just a genius.
It's wonderful. So I was actually going to ask this question, but we have from Taylor, does Next.js allow you to choose which pages are statically generated and which are client-side rendered? And so I think that's talking about like the granularity that you can have with those different settings.
Yeah, so you would to statically generate a page, you would use get static props to fetch your data into the page, or you would use get server-side props. So get static props will build the data at build time, but get server-side props will build the page and the HTML at request time. You can forego both of those functions on your page files and just use React hooks to get the data from an API when the JavaScript is available in the browser.
So it's really whatever pages you want to have, whichever functionality, you really have that flexibility.
Yeah, and that's what's really nice. So, I mean, what's interesting is that I am using React hooks and React state less and less and less with Next.js because of the different ways I can get data with Next.js. And I use a really cool React hook by Vercel called use SWR as well, which, so use stale while revalidate. So I have like a set of serverless functions that are polling data. It's my dashboard for like my Twitter followers and Twitch followers and stuff. And so that's not using ISR, that's just using a serverless function to just refresh the data on the page when it's available. So that's kind of client-side rendered, but it's not even using a React hook. It's using a server-side function that I'm just calling out to when the page loads. So there are so many options. And so you shouldn't just default to React hooks anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, and I haven't even thought about that perspective. I always go static first personally, just like as long as it's not something dynamic where I need it like that. But like I just always use get static props as long as that, you know, takes me to where I need to go.
Yeah, I would always recommend as static as possible with Next.js, because that is the beauty of the framework. And that means your site's going to be faster. You're not going to get those flashes of unstyled content. Your visitors are not going to bounce right off your site if their internet connection is slow. So as static as possible, depending on the data, I would say.
For sure. And we actually have Lee in here, and he has a nice little fun fact that the next release of SWR will make it zero dependency package.
Hi, Lee. Yes, I love that. I love that.
That's amazing. So moving on, I think you covered a lot of things that actually come up as challenges in the e-commerce world. So I'd love to hear, like, what are some of the challenges? And I know you have a background in e-commerce. What are some of the challenges that you know of or faced in the e-commerce world that Next.js is able to help solve?
So one of the biggest things I think is performance. So I worked for a global e-commerce company as a tech lead for a few years. And one of the data points we had was the traffic was higher on mobile, on mobile devices, but the conversion rate was higher on desktop devices. And we know that most people are browsing like on the train to work or something when there wasn't a pandemic. And they're coming up on slow pages because everything is being loaded in by JavaScript on the client, and they can't shop, they can't check out, it's a bad experience. And speed, I think, is the key. Yes, you can go into the accessibility and the UX considerations and blah, blah, blah. But if something is fast, people are going to be able to use your site, and you know, they're going to be more inclined to use your site because they're not just sitting there looking at a screen for hours and hours and hours.
For sure.
Again, I think the different types of data fetching, I think, is key to e-commerce. So how in date does your data need to be? And so we were talking just now about being as static as possible. So yeah, you can render your footer links and your header links from a CMS that don't need to change, and you can build those using get static props statically. You can use ISR for maybe offer banners that can be out of date by like a minute or something. And, you know, so you don't have to rebuild your whole page when you turn on a new offer. You can use ISR or just client-side rendering for things such as dynamic stop levels. And then you can use get server-side props for authentication when you're trying to check out and things like that. So all of these different data points, I think e-commerce is a perfect example to showcase the capabilities and the flexibility of Next.js. And I think all it needs, the biggest thing I would encourage people to ask themselves when building an e-commerce site is, how can I make this as fast as possible? And how crucial is it that the data is exactly up to date? And if it's not that crucial, then use one of the statically generated data fetching methods. And again, if you have an e-commerce shop with thousands and thousands of products. So you know how this is one of the key things. You know how when sometimes on a traditional site, you will have a product page with maybe like 20 variants, and those variants are selected via query parameters. You don't need to do that in Next.js anymore. You can actually build all combinations of routes and pages based on your content from your CMS. So every single page is bookmarkable with a static URL. You don't need to wait for JavaScript to load to view that product. So you're more likely to get conversions because you need the web to be bookmarkable, especially with shopping, because people want to send their friends this new thing that they want to buy. And that's the thing. So I did this big project that it didn't go too well because I was trying to work with Shopify, which was a little bit difficult at the time, but I was trying to create Next.js contentful Shopify site. The whole Next.js and contentful thing was like, bam, in the bag. And we created dynamic routes for every single product and every single variant. And then you could just have a one-click buy. Also, that negates the need for heavy logic in your front-end templates. So for example, you can get so many bugs when you've got like 10 query parameters on the URL for your variants, and you want to add that to your basket. You need to make sure you've got unit tests and regression tests, and to make sure that you're actually going to add that exact product to the basket that's calculated from all those query parameters. With static, dynamically generated routes, it doesn't matter, because when you hit that page and you see that one single product, you can add it to your basket, no problems. And it makes, I used to write unit tests a lot when I was in e-commerce. And I know I don't build like large scale production projects anymore, but they're less needed.
Yeah,
because of this.
I never thought about the side effect of it. Kind of helps with the separation of concerns in regards to you having your view layer where that's ultimately the UI, right? As opposed to like the other stuff, which is going to be more like the logic and the business logic, where you don't have to necessarily have those so intertwined as you might have had to in the past.
And, we're talking a lot in the industry now about separating everything out into microservices and not bundling in like back-end logic with front-end logic. And this is really a really good example of how everything is done on the server at build time. And actually a front-end developer doesn't need to worry about all that scary logic and breaking a £1 million e-commerce site with something like Next.js because of the architecture that it encourages.
That's interesting. And, I want to go back to the whole performance part because, there is actually a direct correlation with conversion rate and performance. And I know there's been like a bunch of studies done. I have them in my slides when I give talks. So I don't know I know Walmart and eBay both did one. But it's super interesting to see that, the more time you focus on that performance, it's not just simply, being able to serve something faster, even though the user experience is definitely really important. Like it actually helps that bottom line, right? But one thing that you also mentioned is the idea of being able to kind of bookmark links and stuff. And that kind of reminds me of things like SEO. And, SEO is pretty important from an e-commerce point of view. Is that something Next.js is able to help out with?
I mean, yeah, if you have all of these static URLs generated at build time, and you can build a sitemap from it using Next sitemap. And that means that Google's going to index every single one of your products. And it's kind of really nicely inbuilt with the architecture of get static props. And actually, the way I do it on my sites is the advice on the Next sitemap docs is to just create a page in your pages folder. And when Next builds that on the server, it runs through the logic and creates you a nice sitemap from all of your data that you're already fetching anyway. So you've got a good sitemap. You've got all of the configuration that you can add using the Next head component, which is built in. Also, there's a really nice plugin that I use called Next SEO, which you can abstract out a lot of the default SEO stuff, like your open graph image and your fav icons and things like that. So really, all you need to add into your head on a product page is the title and the description. I think SEO being important, you want rich results for your products, so you can use Google structured data that just fits in really nicely in Next.js. Actually use that for my blog posts, but you can just, unfortunately, you need to use dangerously set inner HTML with this because of the way it works. But if you've already got your data from your pages and you pass it down into the component, you've already got that data there anyway. So there's no need to do any more client-side fetching and things like that. The biggest thing is, and the fact that everything's static, right? So SEO search engines can't like read pages that have all their data loaded on the client. So I always show this really tiny example of a site that I build with just plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it gets data from Contentful. But when you load the page, it takes a second or two to flash in. So robots that are crawling that site are not going to see that content. But if you're delivering statically generated pages or server-side rendered pages, search engines are going to see that content and be able to understand how to rank it and what the content is. And so that's a good point with any static site generator anyway. But again, if we're talking about with the flexibility of Next.js being make your data as static as possible, you're automatically making a better performing website in search engines.
For sure. And I think that that's a great point, because I've seen a big disconnect in the idea that just because you put the head tags, whether it's with the next head component or using something like React Helmet with other frameworks, the idea that having the tags there when the JavaScript renders doesn't mean that that's going to be there when the original page loads.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. And you can sometimes, I think maybe it was you or someone else, if you use one of those dynamic head rendering things and you inspect your code in the dev tools, not viewing source, so you'll see those head tags in the dev tools. But if you actually view source, you won't necessarily see them because they haven't been delivered in the first document delivery of the page. And that is key. And next head renders that all together and make sure that all of that rich information that you need in your head is there. That's the really, really important thing to think about. That I think it's not obvious, actually. It's not obvious.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely a good point, because inside the dev tools, like, somebody might not know that, because there's definitely not anything obvious that makes like that the dev tools, what it's showing is the original source HTML. Instead, it's the rendered based off of the JavaScript. So I don't know how to solve that, making it intuitive, but it's definitely a disconnect that I see often with people. But
yes.
Cool. So moving on, have you explored Next.js Commerce at all?
I have a little bit, and that was to do some research for the e-commerce project I was doing earlier in the year with Shopify, Contentful, and Next.js. I played around. I loved how it looked. I played around, but the fact that there wasn't any pre-built integrations that are coming soon, by the way, it wasn't really, and I was kind of like trying to build something else, and Next.js Commerce was coming out at the time. So, I mean, I don't really have a need for a shop right now, so I haven't like gone deep into it, but the concept, again, Next.js is delivering on what the people want. To the fact now, soon we're going to be able to spin up a new Next site, link it with Shopify or Sale or whatever, and then bam, you've got a shop that's super fast, super cool. Because this solves a big problem, actually, in that, for example, and I don't want to hate on any of the e-commerce platforms because it's a minefield. I used to work for a startup that was building a competitor for Shopify, and it was a minefield. But what you get a lot with Shopify and all these other things is like the way you add your content in for the products. There's a lot of WYSIWYG based stuff. It's quite difficult to get the data that you need. And so I'm a big believer in the fact that e-commerce sites will become built from little microservices that serve the best purposes. So a headless CMS like Contentful for the static content linked in with the product content, and using something else for the checkout and something else for this, hand picking all these really cool little services that can come together, statically generated via a front-end framework that powers everything. I think we're going to be able to see some some things take off that couldn't be possible before as well. Huge e-commerce platforms, and rightly so, are very expensive to launch and manage, and pre-built solutions like Squarespace and Shopify for devs, you want to do more, right? So if you're a dev who wants to open a shop, you want a bit more control. And so Next.js Commerce is going to kind of give you back that control, I think. And I just have to decide what shop I want to open.
Right, exactly. And no, I think it's especially important now, like, hopefully we're at the tail end of this whole pandemic thing, but like, even like the pandemic aside, like small businesses and stuff, really, they can't afford those big name tools like you're mentioning, and like being able to have that flexibility where they can have more affordable options that can still scale for their small business needs is really important to help them keep running.
And what's great is that the Jamstack really enables that as well, because Next.js is an open source framework. You don't have to pay for it. You can host on Netlify and Vercel for free when you're just starting out. All of this stuff that's open source and this whole ecosystem. Like, imagine that this would not be possible 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
and how could that even be thought of? And so where we've come, like, I'm a big advocate for making tech as accessible and as easy as possible to just build what you want. And this is how it's becoming a reality. And I think it's going to empower a lot of people to do what they want that they never even thought was possible a few years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like it's been a huge game changer in that regard. And it's been awesome to see, little success stories here and there of being able to see, it ultimately help, either save somebody's business or help them take off their business.
Yeah, exactly.
But so that's the end of my questions. Do you have anything that you wanted to kind of add before we step into Q&A, whether it's, Next generally or any of your interesting experience with e-commerce?
E-commerce is a beast. E-commerce is a beast, right? And I don't know whether anyone is ever going to solve it completely. So you can use these tools to try and, get the best out of the situation and make sure that your site is fast and responds to your users' needs and is accessible and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, e-commerce, I think, is one of the hardest things to get right, because people want stuff now and they want it fast and they just want to be satisfied. And if you can't satisfy them in a few seconds and your site is slow or whatever, they are not going to buy your stuff. So don't be afraid if you try this and it fails first time. That's, I guess, what I would say, because from my experience in e-commerce, it's a minefield, but you can learn a lot. So to anyone who wants to try it, good luck and let me know how it goes.
For sure. Let us know on Twitter. Absolutely. So yeah, we can step into the Q&A. So if anybody has questions, make sure you enter them into the chat. But for now, I think there's like one or two that we can go through. Ahmed asks, and he mentioned, or they mentioned adding this on Twitter, but maybe you can answer that verbally. If you have like an example of a site, which pages should use SSR versus which pages should use SSG?
I don't know whether you can decide that on a page level. I think you need to decide it on a data level. So if your data is not going to change very often, use SSG. And if you can afford in your build pipeline to use webhooks to rebuild that page every time you change it in your CMS or wherever, then use SSG, that's fine. I would use SSR where you have query parameters on your URL, without a doubt, because I've seen the benefits of that. I actually, I was building a project and silly me, I just went straight into React hooks with some query parameters. And I was like, hey, wait, no, this is flashing some content. I'm getting undefined. And then it's loading in. And then it clicked with me. That was the one project that it clicked with me, that use server-side rendering when you have some dynamic things to work with in your URL. Also, I would probably use server-side rendering if you're talking to a back-end authentication service. So you need to check if there's a cookie on the server or something like that. But it just thinking about it in terms of data, because also your pages can be split up into little components as well. And yes, you fetch data on a page level, but you might have a little component in the middle of your page that needs client-side data because it's like a stock level or something else. So data first. When I was a tech lead, I used to always now I think I coined this term before Silicon Valley did, but I always talked about middle out. So if you have a team of back-end and front-end devs, you're working as a product team, if you focus on the data parts, the middle of your application, so the back-end sending data and the front-end's receiving data, that's the middle. If you focus on that data structure, you can then start, the front end can start prototyping and the back end can start working on the API contracts. So it's all, data is the key to everything.
I think that's an absolutely great answer. And I actually have a question that I thought of. Can you use get static props and get server side props together? Like, because I'm imagining a scenario where maybe you want to get some static data for your application, but then you don't have to make that additional request at server side. Do you know that answer?
I can't remember. Lee.
Yeah.
Lee,
Lee, if you're still
us.
here, I'm curious.
I can't remember.
But
I don't think you can. I think you would use one or the other, I think.
That's what I was thinking too, but it'd be an interesting use case. Like, say you want to populate it. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyways, so here's another question from Vikrant. How do you build a scalable backend with Next.js? So I think their example here is Express with API routes or just API routes or something else.
This is not my area of expertise.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not sure whether you would still call Next.js a full stack application. I mean, yes, you can build a backend with API routes and serverless functions, but if you need a stateful backend application, I think that needs to be outside of Next.js. We're talking about like microservices and separation of concerns. Use your backend framework or language of choice and database of choice to authenticate and scale that way. I would still say Next.js is a front-end framework that's primarily concerned with serving your front-end application super fast. In my last job, when I was a tech lead, we built a lot of Next.js applications that had a .NET backend. So we always had a backend with the database authentication, and then the Next.js was the presentation layer, but it got all the data from the API at build time. So I think that's probably the more scalable way to do it, rather than all inside one big monolith using serverless functions that spin up and down and don't necessarily maintain state.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, personally, I've really been seeing, like, especially more in the modern web days, is like the front end of the application has really become the nexus of like the entire stack, where like it's able to, that's how it kind of pulls all the pieces together and communicate, especially in a world of microservices where that's where the communication happens. Now, you might have multiple nexuses where you have your web app and like, maybe a native app, but ultimately that's where all the kind of communication happens together.
Yes. And Lee does say, yes, you can either use get static props or get server-side props, one or the other for now. But in the future, you'll be able to mix them, which sounds exciting. Now I need to find a use case for that.
Lee, while you're here, I would love to see some global data fetching methods.
Oh yes, me too. Do you know what? I don't want to hate on this, but one thing I'd love to see is so I needed the same data for like 5 pages, and I wanted to fetch it once, but I had to fetch it 5 times. So feature request. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, right now I've been using, this is getting in a little bit in the weeds, but right now I've been using get initial props, but that works, but it comes with a set of challenges since it removes some of the optimizations.
Yes.
So I'd love to see that. But let's see. We actually have a question from Lee, and it moved up. So what's the most overlooked yet oddly difficult part of e-commerce? That's a good one.
In my experience, from what I've seen in the work that I've done over the time, is accessibility. And accessibility in terms of, and I know this isn't really a Next.js topic, but being able to allow your visitors to use your website with just a keyboard, or use your website with a screen reader. And that is, again, what we're talking about is trying to convert as many people as possible in order that your business thrives. And if you discount all of these people who use your website in different ways, I think that's what's going to cause issues. I think it's really overlooked because everyone's talking about performance, conversion, data, blah, blah, blah. But accessibility, I think, is key to making people enjoy using your site, whatever abilities or disabilities they may have, and creating a beautiful experience for them. And I think closely related to that is personalization. People don't want to see stuff on a website that is irrelevant to them. So here's a little anecdote. I have a favorite shop to site on, and there's a women's section and a men's section, right? And I usually look at the women's section. Sometimes I look at the men's section for my husband. And when I've looked at the men's section, there's obviously like a little cookie in there that remembers I've done that. And when I go back to the site again, it's on the men's section. It's like, why can't you remember that I mainly look at the women's section and I have to click again? Little things like that.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And a little bit like to the, if I don't mind, I'm going to ask my answer as well, because I'm not sure if you're aware, I worked with, like 6 years ago, I worked with an e-commerce store called ThinkGeek. And one thing that I found was that I feel like people kind of take for granted in some of the newer e-commerce solutions like Snipcart and Stripe Checkout is like simply like address forms and like all the part dealing with checkout. Like my mind's kept going like in circles for having to deal with international payments, international addresses. There's so many nuanced things about that I'm in love with the different solutions that allow me to not have to think about that.
I can't believe I missed that. Such a problem. And do you know what? There's one other anecdote based on the like internationalization and stuff. Please never add validation that says that your first names need to have more than one character or 2 characters, because you get so many names from like China and Japan that have like 1 or 2 letter names. Also, e-commerce sites, please let me put the hyphen in my second name, because this validation, it alienates people so much. That's kind of like a personalization, accessibility, internationalization, all the numeronym words. But think about your visitors first and foremost, whatever that may be. I mean, I know we've got into a bit of a global situation where people in the UK know what a zip code means, but if you don't change your validation for a zip code to include UK postcodes, you're not going to allow people to check out. So put the user first. That is first and foremost. And I think the experience and the sales will follow. And I think people are overlooked in e-commerce. It's just product, buy. I've gone on a little bit of a crusade. Sorry. Right.
But ultimately, like people want to buy your products. Like that's why they're going through that process. But then they get frustrated and they bail because of that.
Yes. Let them buy your stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I think I saw one more question in here. So from Taylor, we have, if a site gets updated at least once a day, maybe a couple times a day via APIs and webhooks, would static still work?
Definitely with Next.js, because you can use incremental static regeneration. That's a perfect use case, so you don't run out your build minutes. And what's nice about incremental static regeneration, it doesn't build the whole site either. It just builds that one page that you want to incrementally statically generate. And so that's perfect. And this is the thing, static sites now, they aren't just static ever. You don't get many sites that are used for things unless they're just an online CV or just an online pamphlet or something. Everything on the web now is, you want people to use your site, you want people to interact with it. And so when we say static, it's not really static. It's like static first. It's delivered statically and then progressively enhanced with interactivity and hydrated on the client with JavaScript. And that is the fundamental bottom line of the Jamstack.
Absolutely. And I think, as a final kind of point that I think is really related to this, Corey was mentioning that they're misunderstanding the whole one or the other, because, you like you're kind of talking about, you can generate those static pages, but still make those dynamic API calls.
And those dynamic API calls will be done. So if you create a static page with get static props inside your component, you can then make dynamic API calls on the client. Same, you can use get server-side props on a page level, because these are all page level functions to get data. And then you can, an inner component can then use client-side fetching as well. So one or the other means on a page level, you either use get server-side props to build the HTML on the server, or get static props to build the HTML in the build pipeline. But then again, as we've been talking about, data fetching is so flexible in Next.js. So you've got like 4 or 5 ways to experiment with anyway. So Go wild. You know what? I've got a blog post on my backlog about this, all the different ways I use Next.js to fetch different types of data on my website. Because I think I've got every single data fetching method on my website, on my little blog site.
Yeah.
So that's fun.
And they all have their good reasons. And, you know, I think that's part of the, like, what makes Next.js so great is we have so many different options that really we can tailor to what we need in our requirements.
Exactly. And I think some of the lesser known, more original static site generators like Jekyll, for example, these were not built with that kind of enhancement in mind as such, and that kind of flexibility in mind. Those are the like true static sites, you know, that, yeah, you can put a bit of client-side JavaScript on, but you don't get that flexibility under the hood.
Absolutely. And, you know, speaking of that, I read a while ago that like the idea that Next.js came from was the idea of a universal React application. And that's exactly what you just explained there. The fact that you can, you know, do the entire life cycle all within that same React component.
Yes.
Right. But cool. Well, Salma, thank you so much for coming on to chat today. This has been amazing. And, you know, there's been so much information in this chat and it was amazing. Everybody, please make sure you go over and follow her on Twitch and Twitter for all the amazing things she's doing. Everybody also make sure to check out my new course, E-Commerce on the Jamstack, available over at Level Up Tutorials, where I walk you through building your own online store with Nextjs, headless WordPress, and Snipcart. So before we head off, Salma, any last words?
As ever, build stuff, learn things, love what you do. And if you want to come see me again, I stream 3 times a week on Twitch. I've posted my website in the chat. So you've got all my social links there. You can see how I fetch data via Next.js on that website as well. And I just want to give you a big thanks for having me and being so nice in chat. This was really fun. And I want to see you all again soon.
Absolutely. Sounds great. So until next time, I'm Colby Fayok. Thank you very much.